So just to begin this paper with a bit of context, my name's Tom Grimwood and I'm a philosopher for a number of various reasons I won't go into. Spent the early 2010s running a master's program in social work. And that really led me to think about how social work and philosophy were often engaged in quite similar concerns, and that there was much to learn from each other beyond the traditional, slightly hierarchical relationship where one borrowed ideas from the other. In particular, there were a number of conceptual tensions and discussions to be had around things like the nature of autonomy, value, power, and interpretation, which can change and shape the significance of different settings. For example, the autonomy of the social worker, the autonomy of the service user, the autonomy of the service, and even the autonomy of the philosopher writing about those services, and so on. Now, for a number of reasons, these aren't discussions which often take place in frontline practice or education of either social work or philosophy. So I'm interested in finding a space where these can be thought through. I tried this a few years back with a book called Key Debates in Social Work and Philosophy, where I explored some of the sites of dialogue through the lens of cultural and philosophical hermeneutics. And I'm currently working on a follow-up to that book with a book called Against Critical Thinking. And this is interested in expanding those hermeneutic approaches in relation to social ontologies in order to think through the multiple bodies and horizons of practice which separate social work from, say, the interpretation of a text. So this paper is a work in progress for part of that book, and I'm really keen for any feedback on what are still largely unfolding ideas. So the topic of my paper is the question of what I'll call the review. In the UK, these have gone by the name of serious case reviews. They're now called safeguarding practice reviews. And in other countries, they have different names, but they essentially consist of the same approach. So I'm just going to call them reviews with capital R from here on in. For all of them, what happens is if there's been a serious breach in safeguarding with a child or a vulnerable adult, a review takes place to ascertain what happened and how multi-agency working can be improved to ensure it doesn't happen again. So this isn't a prosecution of individuals that are guilty of serious misconduct. That takes place elsewhere. It's, at least on paper, a system-wide learning and improvement exercise. We can see from this example, this is an old serious case review, but the process isn't that different now, that this is a process-driven operation. And it involves a critical inquiry around several modalities: information and causal determinism, data systems and documentation, and cultural codes such as practice roles and expectations of normality. So what do these reviews tend to find? Well, what's interesting is the uniformity of such reviews across local areas, across the UK, across the United States, across Australia, across everywhere they happen. They essentially always tend to find much the same thing, and they tend to have much the same recommendations. And as a result, not only are their findings of their critical processes similar, and the learning they recommend similar, but also the similarity of the critiques of the reviews themselves that have emerged in response to them within social work literature are also quite similar. And this leaves us as a bit of an impasse, as we'll see, because it's obviously important to address safeguarding breakdowns. Nobody disagrees with this. But beyond this principle, both the reviews and their critiques often utilize similar terms and invoke similar authorities. And as a result, we're left with an interpretative problem which seems to contradict the systematic certainty that the review process promises. Now, I'm not proposing to solve these issues, as it's certainly not for me to tell social workers how to do their job. I'm also not going to talk about the details of the reviews because they're highly emotive and often intense. So we need to be clear on our focus here, which is whether it's possible to rethink the concepts underpinning the critical disputes themselves and ask what is at stake in terms of knowledge, expertise, and judgment in philosophical terms. So first, let's consider some of the main critiques which, as I say, are remarkably persistent across the different forms of safeguarding review. Preston Shute identifies 5 key areas. The first is that they're insufficiently systematic. Reviews are nominally systematic in approach, but effectively not systematic enough, say the critics. They can identify errors, but do not deal with bigger questions of why something happened, because they tend to leave out wider systems and organizations in play, in particular economic and political aspects, underfunding, broader community issues, and so on. Added to this is the frequent suspicion of bias in terms of local authorities investigating their own errors. So the reviews are often done by the same people whose organizations are in question. This was brought to light in the infamous Baby P scandal, where a review took place but then had to happen again with an independent chair brought in because it wasn't felt it was rigorous enough. As I've noted before, another site of critique is that they have very repetitive findings and repetitive recommendations. The findings and recommendations are almost always procedural in nature, often aimed at better management of services rather than addressing what the sociologist John Law might term the messiness of delivery. One problem many social workers complain about is the sheer number of reviews which are expected to be read, digested, and acted upon. Ironically, the number highlighting bad practices then don't cut through to the coalface of delivery because there isn't the time to read them. There's an interesting alignment here with something that's happened in maternity provision in the UK, where a number of scandals have exposed that problems are not procedural, but to do with organisational and workplace culture. The problem is, while steps are now being taken to address this, commissioners often turn to what I would call the cheat sheet methods, such as behavioural science, which look good to managers, but carry with them a number of epistemological and ethical assumptions that are ill-fitting for the case at hand. The recommendations almost always require more training. This is a constant call in social work research. Rarely are the principles of training as a form of meaning-making challenged. As a result, it is rare for learning from reviews to embed themselves in practice. This requires a more sophisticated understanding of change, say its critics. For example, Munro and Hubbard refer to the difficult choices when weighing the risks of whether or not to remove a child from their parents. It may not be just parental resistance or disguised compliance that impacts on decision making, nor resources available to the practitioners in terms of time to think or expertise to draw upon. The historical experiences of the agencies involved will also impact on present day decision making, and that also takes place in the context of societal ambivalence about the powers available to social workers. So, like the previous point, it's felt the reviews just don't pick up on the messiness of it all. Added to this is a perceived failure to engage practitioners. Practitioner views in reviews are filtered through the lens of the panel. They are often defensive as a result. While the review is meant to be a learning process, it is difficult, particularly in some of the more horrific cases, for there not to be what we might call in the UK an arse-saving exercise by the practitioners. For this reason, Munro advocated a need for a systems approach to counteract the blame culture and singling out individuals. But this has its own tensions. Even back in 1975, theorists such as Laporte were arguing that systems approaches presents only, this is a quote, a premise rather than a theory, and to have substance, its constructs must extend to other notions, the mechanistic equilibrium of the machine, the homeostatic equilibrium of the ecological niche, the adaptive dynamics of organic species. That's Laporte's words. In other words, while the claim that the events within a safeguarding review operated within micro, meso, and macro structures is a fine starting point, it implemented these only while leaving the other aspects of human existence as relatively fixed and unchanging, and certainly not as responsive to interrelations with other aspects as we can observe they are. Summarizing this, in effect, everything reviews are meant to address are also a point of contention. Hence, the review is process-driven, but because of the different modalities of understanding involved, a diverse range of approaches and methodologies are used by panels without an agreement on how they should be put together. So it's at this point I find the social ontology of Manuel de Landa particularly useful for unpicking some of these disputes. Delander's use of assemblages to describe social phenomena rejects the organismic, have to be careful how I say that, organismic metaphors which has governed more traditional approaches, where the parts and the whole of a phenomena are seen as analogous to organs within a body. Such a metaphor, according to Delander, frames the part-whole relationship as though they follow an inherent internal logic. In the case of reviews, this logic is assumed to be one of systematic self-correction, that the missing or dysfunctional parts will emerge and be addressed or replaced. By asking where the mistakes happen is a matter of how things such as information flow, such as data systems, such as cultural codes, how they relate together in terms of an overall single logic. This framing, however, presents both a micro and macro level problem, which Delander calls reductionism. Micro-reductionism sees a whole as the sum of its parts. Macro-reductionism sees parts as the product of the whole. Both of Delander's micro and macro reductionisms can be detected in the critical impasses we've discussed. We can see that a review is not simply the aggregate of its parts. While one may argue whether social workers, managers, and service users utilize the same reality, their roles in the review are clearly positioned differently, as is evidenced by the range of modalities of knowledge involved. Likewise, neither can the parts of the review be seen as existing purely from the review alone. This would place a single event, typically the consequences of the safeguarding mistakes, as a kind of sum point of all actions leading up to it, giving a false narrative, when in fact all of the component parts have only what Delander calls a relation of exteriority to each other. The assemblage's only unity, as Deleuze once wrote, is that of co-functioning as alliances rather than filiations. In Glenn Savage's words, contingently obligatory relations that are always evolving in form. Such relations come together through what Delander, borrowing from Deleuze, calls territorialization. Conversely, deterritorialization pulls assemblages apart. In the case of reviews, we see that the territorializing mode is a useful way of thinking. First, the accepted processes have gone wrong. There's been a problem with safeguarding. The review attempts to assemble the component parts into a re-territorialized understanding in order to enhance what Delander calls the coding of the territory. Coding here refers to the expressive components of an assemblage, not only the managerialist discourse or the language of blame and judgment, but also rituals, non-verbal communication, and behaviors. The real issue then is that conversely, the organismic metaphor, which the reviews tend to insist on, effectively sees the whole representing the parts and the parts representing the whole. But within this prism of representation, we have seen that the outcomes of reviews suggest a reality which does not match with the lived experience of either practitioners or service users. Indeed, in John Law's discussion of the inquiry of the Ladbroke Grove rail crash, he notes that the ontological assumptions of the exercise are embedded within what he calls, quote, the framing assumptions of Euro-American metaphysics. He argues that in assembling an inquiry, certain interpretative commitments are made in order to make sense of the myriad of complexities that might have happened in the throes of multi-agency and multi-service user practice. He says, in particular, reality is taken to be definite, singular, prior, and independent, and is made that way. A coherent account of the world is possible, even at moments when things have gone dreadfully wrong. The inquiry thus denies the possibility of non-coherence, multiplicity, priority, and all the rest. And as Law notes, in the real conditions of the inquiry, there is little choice. Such a lack of choice, which constitutes both the objectivity of the review and its overly procedural emphasis, ultimately offers a gesture of closure, which nevertheless continues to repeat itself across all the different reviews. So we can, of course, use Delander's insights to suggest that the sociality of what the reviews critically examine is ill-served by its assumptions of a single logic. Likewise, we can suggest that it is the ontology of the review which lends itself to the forms of managerialism which social workers in practice typically resist. However, as Ian Buchanan has noted of Delander's work, this could be tantamount to just mapping out various parts and activities and saying, well, it's more complex than you think. And this wouldn't be that different to understanding the lack of embedded learning and the repetition of safeguarding failures in terms of the ongoing tensions in social work between, for example, practice wisdom and codified programs. And everyone knows that already. So I think this is why it's important to go back to the critical impasse again. And we can note that the cycle of territorialization is not limited to the reviews themselves, but also the criticisms of it. For both, policy and procedure is subjected to criticism. Are you doing what you're meant to be doing? Are you representing what you claim to represent? Is your method coherent? And the end result differs only slightly. So we have the review process and we have the critique of the review process. So I think there's a parallel issue surrounding the ontology of critique in relation to the arrangement of the review by itself. So, can we reassemble this idea of critique, which I think is really crucial to why these impasses exist and continue? Rita Felsky has written about how traditional critical thought depends upon a rhetoric of defamiliarization, a rhetoric which necessarily positions critical thinking in its own exceptional space of judgment. This rhetoric suggests that when we apply critical thinking, everything can be defamiliarized, everything except critique. Because critique is inherently opposed to convention, it is not subject to the same scrutiny it insists on for the everyday world of practice. As a result, Felsky argues that the social worth of critique can, it seems, only be cashed out in terms of a rhetoric of againstness. Critical thinking has, in her view, developed a disproportionate focus on critique and suspicion at the expense of thinking as an embodied practice in time and space. And this is, I think, a strong example of what assemblage theorists call the reification of particular terms, which includes the importance of their relations to other terms within a gathered assemblage. And indeed, even within much assemblage literature, critique is often used merely as a tool to apply to the framing of relations rather than inherently embedded within them. But of course, critique carries with it its own set of coding and its own territorializing practices. Bruno Latour drew some of these out in his infamous 2003 paper, Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? Here, Latour points to the ways in which critical thinking has followed an idea that there is no efficient way to criticize matters of fact except by moving away from them and directing one's attention toward the conditions that made them possible. But this meant accepting much too uncritically what matters of fact were. He ascribes this to the legacy of Kant's model of critique, something which Michael J. Thompson has also pointed to in his argument for a social ontology. Separation of reason as a capacity of cognition and the world as an object of cognition. So criticality seen as something separate from the world itself. But matters of fact, Latour argues, are only partial and polemical renderings of matters of concern. He thus asks whether there is a way of transforming the critical urge in the ethos of someone who adds reality to matters of fact and not subtract reality. So my suggestion is that we take Latour and Felsky seriously and use the unique space between social work and philosophy to ask, how does critique manifest itself as an assemblage within the context or the broader assemblage of the review processes and their subsequent academic, critical and practitioner discussion? What is at stake and how is what is at stake produced from the arrangements of particular aspects of the impasses we have discussed? Just to finish, I'll offer these as starting points based on what we've discussed so far. First, I think we need to look at how credibility emerges out of assemblage relations in a social setting. Much of the review discussion is centered on the objectivity or potential bias of the panels and the reviews themselves. Rather than adopt the cognitive notions of objectivity or disinterest, I mean, is it possible to be disinterested in a safeguarding case? One would argue perhaps not. Rather than follow that kind of Kantian model of critique, the issue is more around what I think we might call an economy of credibility, which goes beyond standard social science measures of validity or coherence and is much more dependent on both service users and practitioners' relationship with broader organizations. So how is that credibility assembled, should be our question. Secondly, suspicion. Obviously, there is a sense in which suspicion, certainly for Felsky, has become a hallmark of this reified critique. But underlying credibility, there is a distinct role of suspicion. But suspicion doesn't need to be negative in that sense. It's rather an understanding that terms can never be fully reified, can never be explicit fully or fully present. They always require an interpretation. These forms of suspicion and how they relate and affect each other, for example, the suspicion of the service users, the suspicion of the practitioners, the suspicion of the public, are key for what is presented and arranged within a review. Thirdly, repetition. To what extent is the repetition at work in outcomes and recommendations a rhetorical or ritual device rather than a linear succession of results? In other words, what is the role of the kind of critical malaise that Peter Sloterdijk once termed as a series of rigged moves where everyone already knows the answer in the application of critique in the case of reviews? I think moving towards an assemblage approach has a lot of highly positive possibilities for unpacking some of these impasses, as long as we see critique itself as part of the assemblage. Thank you very much.